We are reading Wicked, the life and the times of the Wicked Witch of the West. For the first part, I will leave a link in the comments. The Clock of the Time Dragon. Frax was more concerned for Melina than she knew. He stopped at the first fisherman's hut. He saw and spoke with the man at the half door. Could a woman or two spend the day and if needed the night with Melina? It would be a kindness. Frax nodded with a wince of gratitude, acknowledging without words that Melina was not a great favorite in these parts. Then, before continuing around the end of Hill's Water and over to Rush Margins, he stopped at a fallen tree and drew 2 letters from his sash. The writer was the distant cousin of Frax's, also a minister. Weeks earlier, the cousin had spent time in valuable ink on a description of what was being called the Clock of the Time Dragon. Frax prepared himself for the day's holy campaign by rereading about the idol clock. I write in haste, Brother Rexbar, to catch my impressions before they fade. The clock of the Time Dragon is mounted on a wagon and stands as high as a giraffe. It is nothing more than a tottering, freestanding theater, punched on all 4 sides with alcoves and proscenium arches. On the flat roof is a clockwork dragon, an invention of green-painted leather, silvery claws, ruby jeweled eyes. Its skin is made of hundreds of overlapping discs of copper, bronze, and iron. Beneath the flexible folds of its scales is an armature controlled by clockwork. The Time Dragon circles on its pedestal, flexes its narrow leathery wings. They make a sound like a bellows, and belches out sulphurous balls of flaming orange stink. Below, featured in the dozens of doorways, windows, and porches, are puppets, marionettes, figurines, creatures of folk tale, caricatures of peasants and royalty alike, animals and fairies and saints, our unionist saints. Brother Rexbar, stolen out from underneath us. I get enraged. The figures move on sprockets. They wheel in and out of doorways. They bend at the waist. They dance and waddle and dally with each other. Who had endangered this time dragon, this fake oracle, this propaganda tool for wickedness that challenged the power of unionship and of the unnamed god? The clock's handlers were a dwarf and some narrow-waisted minions who seemed to have only enough brains capacity among them to pass a hat. Who else was benefiting besides the dwarf and his beauty boys? The cousin's second letter had warned that the clock was making its way next to Rush Margins and had told a more specific story. The entertainment began with a thrum of strings and a rattle of bones. The crowd pushed close, wooing. Within the lighted window of a stage, we saw a marriage bed with a puppet wife and husband. The husband was asleep, and the wife sighed. She made a motion with her carved hands to suggest that her husband was pointlessly small. The audience shrieked with laughter. The puppet wife went to sleep herself. When she was snoring, the puppet husband sneaked out of bed. At this point, up above, the dragon turned on its base and pointed its talons into the crowd, indicating without a doubt a humble well-digger named Grime, who has been faithful, if inattentive husband. Then the dragon reared back and stretched 2 fingers into a come-hither gesture, isolating the widow named Letta and her snaggle-toothed maiden daughter. The crowd hushed and fell away from Grime, Letta, and the blushing maid, as if they had suddenly been inflicted with running sores. The dragon rested again, but draped the wing over another archway, which lit up to reveal the puppet husband. Wandering out in the night, along came a puppet widow, with sprig hair and high color, dragging along a protesting, flinty-toothed daughter. The widow kissed the puppet husband and pulled off his leather trousers. He was equipped with 2 full sets of mail goods, one in the front and another hanging off the base of his spine. The widow positioned her daughter on the abbreviated prong in the front, and herself took advantage of the more menacing arrangement in the rear. The 3 puppets bucked and rocked, emitting squeals of glee. When the puppet widow and her daughter were through, they dismounted and kissed the adulterous puppet husband. Then they kneed him simultaneously fore and aft. He swung on springs and hinges, trying to hold all his wounded parts. The audience roared. Green, the actual well-digger, sweated drops as big as grapes. Letta pretended to guffaw, but her daughter had already disappeared from shame. Before the evening was out, Grine was set upon by his agitated neighbors and investigated for the grotesque anomaly. Letta was shunned. Her daughter seems to have vanished entirely. We suspect the worst. At least Grine wasn't killed. Yet who can say how our souls have been stamped by witnessing such a cruel drama? All souls are hostages to their human envelopes, but souls must decay and suffer at such indignity, don't you agree? Sometimes it seemed to Frex that every itinerant witch and toothless seer in Oz who could perform even the most transparent of spells had seized on the outback district of Wend Hardings to scratch out a trade. He knew that folks from Rush Martins were humble, their lives were hard, and their hopes few. As the draw dragged on, the traditional Unionist faith was eroding. Frex was aware that the clock of the Time Dragon combined the appeals of ingenuity and magic, and he would have to call on his deepest reserves of religious conviction to overcome it. If his congregation should prove vulnerable to the so-called pleasure faith, succumbing to the spectacle and violence, well, what next? He would prevail. He was their minister. He had pulled their teeth and buried their babies and blessed their kitchen pots for years now. He had abased himself in their names. He had wandered with an unkempt beard and a begging bowl from hamlet to hamlet, leaving poor Melina alone in the minister's lodge for weeks at a time. He had sacrificed for them. They couldn't be swayed by this time dragon creature. They owed him. He moved on, shoulders squared, jaw set, stomach in a sour uproar. The sky was brown with flying sand and grit. The wind rushed high over the hills with the sound of tremulous wail, as if pushing through some fissure rock on a ridge beyond any Frex could see. The birth of a witch. It was nearly evening by the time Frex had worked up the courage to enter the ramshackle hamlet of Rush Martins. He was in a deep sweat. He hit his heels to the ground and pumped his clenched fist and called out in a hoarse, carrying tone, "Haste, O ye of small confidence, gather while ye may, for temptation is abroad to try ye sorely." These words were archaic, even ridiculous, but they worked. Here came the sullen fishermen dragging their empty nets up from the dock. Here came the subsistence farmers whose hard-scrabble pots had borne little during this dry year. Before he had even begun, they all looked guilty as sin. They followed him to the rickety steps of the canoe repair house. Frex knew that everyone expected this evil clock to arrive at any instant. Gossip was as contagious as the plague. He yelled at them for their thirsty anticipation. Ye are dull as toddlers reaching their hands to touch the pretty embers. Ye are as if spawn of dragon womb, ready to suck on teats of fire. These were time-worn scriptural imprecations, and they fell a little flat tonight. He was tired and not at his best. Brother Frexbar said free, "The mayor of Rush Martins, could you perhaps tone down your harangue until we get a chance to see what fresh news form temptation might take?" "You have no mettle to resist the new forms," said Frex, bidding. "Haven't you been our able teacher these several years?" said Free. "We've hardly had such a good chance to prove ourselves against sin. We're looking forward to to the spiritual test of it all. The fisherman laughed and jeered, and Frex intensified his glare. But at the sound of unfamiliar wheels in the stony ruts of the road, they all turned their heads and fell silent. He had lost their attention before he had gotten started. The clock was being drawn by 4 horses and escorted by the dwarf and his cohort of young thugs. Its broad roof was crowned by the dragon. But what a beast! It looked poised as if ready to spring, as if indeed invested with life. The skin of the house was decorated in carnival colors, burnished with gold leaf. The fisherman gaped as it drew near. Before the dwarf could announce the time of the performance, before the crowd of youths could draw out their clubs, Frex leaped on the lower step of the thing, a fold-down stage on hinges. Why is this thing called a clock? The only clock face it has is flat, dull, and lost in all that distracting detail. Furthermore, the hands don't move. Look, see for yourselves. They're painted to remain at 1 minute before midnight. All you'll see here is mechanics, my friends. I know this for a fact. You'll see mechanical cornfields growing, moons waxing and waning, a volcano to spew a soft red cloth done up with black and red sequins. With all of this tick-tocky business, why not have a pair of circulating arms on the clock face? Why not? I ask you. I'm asking you. Yes, you. Garnet, and you, Stoy, and you, Pirippa. Why no real clock here? They were not listening. Garnet and Stoy and Pirippa, nor were the others. They were too busy staring in anticipation. The answer, of course, is that the clock isn't meant to measure earthly time, but the time of the soul, redemption and condemnation time. For the soul, each instant is always a minute short of judgment. 1 minute short of judgment, my friends. If you died in the next 60 seconds, would you want to spend eternity in the suffocating depths reserved for idolaters? Awful lot of noise in the neighborhood tonight, said someone in the shadows, and the spectators laughed. Above Frex, he whirled to see from a little door had emerged a small, yapping puppet dog, its hair dark and tightly curled as Frex's own. The dog bounced on a spring, and the pitch of its chatter was annoyingly high. The laughter grew. Evening fell harder, and it was less easy for Frex to tell who was laughing. Who now was shouting for him to move aside so they could see. He wouldn't move, so he was bundled unceremoniously from his perch. The dwarf gave a poetic welcome. All lives are activity without meaning. We burrow rat-like into life, and we squirm rat-like through it, and rat-like we are flung into our graves at the end. Now and then, why shouldn't we hear a voice of prophecy or see a miracle play? Beneath the apparent sham of indignity of our rat-like lives, a humble pattern and meaning still applies. Come nearer, my good people, and watch what a little extra knowledge occurs for our lives. The time dragon sees before and beyond, and within the truth of your story, span of years here. Look at what it shows you. The crowd pushed forward. The moon had risen, its light like the eye of an angry, vengeful god. Give over, let me go, Frex called. It was worse than he had thought. He had never been manhandled by his own congregation. The clock unfolded a story about a publicly pious man with lamb's wool beard and dark curly locks who preached simplicity, poverty, and generosity while keeping a hidden coffer of gold and emeralds in the double-hinged bosom of a weak-chinned daughter of blue blood society. The scoundrel was run through with a long iron stake in most indelicate way and served up to his hungry flock as roast flank of minister. This panders to your basest instincts, Frex, Rex yelled, his arms folded and his face magenta with fury. But now that darkness was almost total, someone came up from behind him to silence him. An arm encircled his neck. He twisted to see which damned parishioner took such liberties, but all the faces were cloaked by hoods. He was kneed in the groin and doubled over, his face in the dirt. A foot kicked him square between the buttocks and his bowels released. The rest of the crowd, however, was not watching. They were howling with the mirth at some other entertainment put on by the clock dragon. A sympathetic woman in a widow's shawl grabbed his arm and led him away. He was too fouled, too much in pain to strain up and see who it was. "I'll put you down in the root cellar. I will under the burlap," groaned the good wife. "For they'll all be after you tonight with pitchforks the way the thing is behaving itself. They'll look for you in your lodge, but they won't look in my keeping room." "Melina," he croaked, "they'll find her." "She'll be seen to," said his neighbor. "Weak women can manage that much, I guess." In the minister's lodge, Melina struggled with her consciousness as a pair of midwives went in and out of focus before her. One was a fishwife. The other, a palsied crone. They took turns feeling her forehead, peering between her legs and stealing glances at the beautiful trinkets and treasures Melina had managed to bring here from the Cohen grounds. "You chew the paste of penwabble leaves, Ducky, you do that. You'll be unconscious before you know it," said the fishwife. "You'll relax, out will pop the little sweetheart, and all will be well in the morning. Thought you could smell of rosewater and fairy dew, but you stink like the rest of us. Chew on, my ducky, chew on." At the sound of a knock, the crone looked up guiltily from the chest she was kneeling before and rummaging through. She let the lid close with a bang and affected a position of prayer, eyes closed. "Enter," she called. A maiden with a tender skin and high color came in. "Oh, I hoped someone would be here," she said. "How is she?" "Nearly out, and so is the babe," answered the fishwife. "An hour more, I reckon." "Well, I'm told to warn you. The men are drunk and on the prowl. They've been riled up by the dragon of the magic clock, you know, and are looking for Frex to kill him. The clock said to. They'll likely stagger out here. We'd better get the wife safely away." "Can she be moved?" "No, I cannot be moved," thought Melina. "And if the peasants find Frex, tell them to kill him good and hard for me, for I never knew a pain so extraordinary that it made me see blood behind my own eyes. Kill him for doing this to me." At this thought, she smiled in a moment of relief and passed out. "Let's leave her out here and run for it," said the maiden. "The clock said to kill her too, and the little dragons she's going to give birth to. I don't want to get caught." "We've got our own reputations to uphold," said the fishwife. "We can't abandon the fancy lady thing in mid-delivery. I don't care what any clock says." Crone had her head back in the chest, said, "Anyone for some real lace from Gilligan?" "There's a hay cart in the lower field. Let's do it now," said the fishwife. "Come, help me fetch it. You, old mother hag, get your face out of the linens and come dampen this pretty pink brow. Right-o, now we go." A few minutes later, the crone, the wife, and the maiden were trundling the hay cart along rarely used track through the spindles and bracken of the autumn woods. The wind had picked up. It whistled over the trees, foreheads of the cloth hills. Melina, sprawled in blankets, heaved and moaned in unconscious pain. They heard a drunken mob pass with pitchforks and torches, and the women stood silent and terrified, listening to the slurred curses. Then they pressed on with a greater urgency until they came upon a foggy copse, the edge of the graveyard for all unconsecrated corpses. Within it they saw the blurred outlines of the clock. It had been left there for safekeeping by the dwarf. No fool he could guess that this particular corner of the world was the last place jumpy villagers would seek tonight. The dwarf and his boykins were drinking in the tavern too, said the maiden breathlessly. "There's no one here to stop us." The crone said, So you've been peering in the tavern windows at the man, you slut? She pushed open the door in the back of the clock. She found a scrawl space. Pendulums hung ominously in the gloom. Huge toothed wheels looked primed to slice any trespasser into sausage rounds. "Come on, drag her in," said the crone. The night of the torches and fog gave way at dawn to broad fluffs of thundercloud, dancing skeletons of lightning. Glimpses of blue sky appeared briefly through the sometimes it rained so hard that it seemed more like mud drops falling than water. The midwives, crawling on hands and knees out of the back of the clock wagon, had their little discharge at last. They protected the infant from the dripping gutter. "Look, a rainbow," said the senior, bobbing her head. A sickly scarf-colored light hung in the sky. What they saw rubbing the caul and blood of the skin, was it just a trick of the light? After all, following the storm, the grass did seem to throb with its own color. The roses singed and hovered with crazy glory on their stems. But even with these effects of light and atmosphere, the midwives couldn't deny what they saw. Beneath the spit of the mother's fluids, the infant glistened a scandalous shade of pale emerald. There's no wail, no bark of newborn outrage. The child opened its mouth, breathed, and then kept its own counsel. "Whine, you fiend," said the crone. "It's your job." The baby shrieked its obligations. "Another willful boy," said the fishwife, sighing. "Shall we kill it?" "Don't be so nasty to it," said the crone. "It's a girl." "Ha," said the bleary-eyed maiden. "Look again, there's the weather vane." For a minute they were in disagreement, even with the child naked before them. Only after a second and third rub was it clear that the child was indeed feminine. Perhaps in labor some bit of organic effluvia had become caught and quickly dried in the cloven place. Once toweled, she had observed to be prettily formed, with a long, elegant head, forearms nicely torn out, clever pinching little buttocks, cunning little fingers with scratchy little nails, and an undeniable green cast to the skin. There was a salmon blush in her cheeks and belly, a beige effect around the clenched eyelids, a tawny stripe on the scalp showing the pattern of eventual hair, but the primary effect was vegetable. "Look what we get for our trouble," said the maiden. "A little green pat of butter. Why don't we kill it? You know what people will say." "I think it's rotten," said the fishwife, and checked for the root of a tail, counted fingers and toes. "It smells like dung." "That is dung you're smelling, you idiot. You're squatting in a cow patty pie." "It's sick. It's feeble. That's why the color." "Lose it in the puddle. Drown the thing. She'll never know. She'll be out for hours in her ladylike faints." They giggled. They cradled the infant in the crook of their arms, passing it around to test for weight and balance. To kill it was the kindest course of action. The question was how. Then the child yawned, and the fishwife absent-mindedly gave it a finger to nurse on, and the child bit the finger off at the second uncle. It almost choked on the gush of blood. The digit dropped out of its mouth into the mud like bobbin. The woman catapulted into action. The fishwife lunged to strangle the girl, and the crone and the maiden flared up in defense. The finger was dug out of the mare and shoved in an apron pocket, possibly to sew back on the hand they had lost it. "It's a cock." She just realized she didn't have one, screeched the maiden, and fell on the ground laughing. "Oh, beware the stupid boy first tries to please himself with her. She'll snip his young sprout off for a souvenir." The midwives crawled back into the clock and dropped the thing at its mother's breast, afraid to consider mercy murder for the fear that what else the baby might bite. "She'll chop the tit next. That'll bring her drowsy frailness around quick enough." The crone chuckled. "Though what a child that sips blood even before its first suck of mother's milk." They left a pipkin of water nearby, and under cover of the next squall, they went squelching away to find their sons and husbands and brothers and berate and beat them if they were available, or bury them if not. In the shadows, the infants stared ahead at the oiled and regular teeth of time's clock. Maladies and remedies. For days, Melina couldn't bear to look at the thing. She held it as a mother must. She waited for the groundwater of maternal affection to rise and overwhelm her. She did not weep. She chewed pinlobble leaves to float away from the disaster. It was a she. It was a her. Melina practiced conversations in her thinking when she was alone. The twitching of an unhappy bundle was not a male. It was not neutered. It was a female. It slept, looking like a heap of cabbage leaves washed and left a drain on the table. In a panic, Melina rode to Colwood Ground to drag Nanny from her retirement. Frex went ahead in a carriage to collect Nanny from the way station at Stone's Bar End. On the trip back, Nanny asked Frex what was wrong. "What is wrong?" he sighed, and was lost in thought. Nanny realized she had chosen her words poorly. Now Frex was distracted. He began to mumble in a general way about the nurture of evil. A vacuum set up by the inexplicable absence of the unnamed god, and into which spiritual poison must rush. A vortex. "I mean, what is the state of the child?" retorted Nanny explosively. "It's not the universe, but the single child I need to hear about. If I'm going to be any help, why does Melina call for me instead of for her mother? Why is there no letter from her grandfather? He's the eminent trump. For goodness sakes, Melina can't have forgotten her duty so thoroughly. Or is life out there in the country worse than we thought?" "It's worse than we thought," said Frex grimly. "The baby. You had better be prepared, Nanny, so you don't scream. The baby is damaged." "Damaged?" Nanny's grip on her valise tightened, and she looked out over the red-leafed pear fruit trees by the side of the road. "Frex, tell me everything." "It's a girl," said Frex. "Damage indeed," said Nanny mockingly, but Frex, as usual, misused the dig. "Well, at least Nanny's title preserved for another generation. Has she got all her limbs?" "Yes." "Any more than she needs?" "No." "Is she sucking?" "We can't let it. It has extraordinary teeth, Nanny. It has shark's teeth or something like. Well, she won't be the first child to grow on a bottle or a rag instead of a tit. Don't worry about that." "It's the wrong color," said Frex. "What color is the wrong color?" For a few moments Frex could only shake his head. Nanny did not like him, and she would not like him, but she softened. "Frex, it can't be that bad. There's always a way out. Tell Nanny." "It's green," he finally said. "Nanny, it's green as moss." "She's green, you mean? It's a she, for heaven's sakes." "It's not for heaven's sake." Frex began to weep. "Heaven is not improved by it, Nanny, and heaven does not approve. What are we to do?" "Hush," Nanny detested weeping men. "It can't be as bad as all that. There isn't a snip of low blood in Melina's veins. Whatever blight the child has will respond to Nanny's treatment. Trust Nanny." "I trusted in the unnamed God," sobbed Frex. "We don't always work at cross purposes, God and Nanny," said Nanny. She knew this was blasphemous, but she couldn't resist a gibe as long as Frex's resistance was down. "But don't worry, I will breathe a word to Melina's family. We'll sort this out in a flash, and no one need know. The baby has a name?" "Elphaba," he said, "after Saint Elphaba of the waterfall." "Yes, a fine old name. You'll use a common nickname, Fabala, I suppose. Who even knows if she'll live long enough to grow into a nickname? Breck sounded as if he hoped this would be the case. Interesting country. Are we in Wen Harding's yet? Nanny asked. To change the subject, but Frex had folded up inside, barely bothering to guide the horses onto the correct track. The country was filthy, depressed, peasant-ridden. Nanny began to wish she had not set out in her best traveling gown. Roadside, robbers might expect to find gold on such a refined-looking older woman, and they might be right, for Nanny sported a golden garden stolen years ago from her ladyship's boudoir. What a humiliation if the garter should turn up these years later on a Nanny's well-turned, if aging, thigh. But Nanny fears were unfounded, for the carriage arrived without incident in the yard of the minister's cottage. Let me see the baby first, said Nanny. It will be easier and fairer on Melina if I know what we're dealing with. And this wasn't hard to arrange, as Melina was out cold thanks to pain level leaves, while the baby in the basket on the table wailed softly. Nanny drew up a chair so she wouldn't hurt herself if she fainted dead away. Frex, put the basket on the floor where I can look into it. Frex obliged, and then went to return the horses and carriage to the flea, who rarely needed them for the majoral duties, but loaned them out during a little political capital. The infant was wrapped in linens. The nanny and the baby's mouth and ears were strapped with a sling. The nose looked like a knob of bad mushroom poking up for air, and the eyes were open. Nanny leaned closer. The child couldn't be, 3 weeks old? Yet, as Nanny moved from side to side looking at the profile of the forehead from the ankle and that so as to judge the shape of the mind, the girl's eyes tracked her back and forth. They were brown and rich, the color of overturned earth, flecked with mica. There were a network of fragile red lines at each soft angle where the eyelids met, as if the girl had been bursting the blood threads from the exertion of watching and understanding. And the skin, oh yes, the skin was green as sin. Not an ugly color, Nanny thought, just not a human color. She reached out and let her finger drift across the baby's cheek. The infant flinched, and her backbone arched, and the wrapping, which was tucked securely around the child from neck to toe, split open like a husk. Nanny gritted her teeth and was determined not to be cowed. The baby had exposed herself sternum to groin, and the skin on her chest was the same remarkable color. Have you ever touched this child yet, you two? Murmured Nanny. She put her hand, palm down on the child's heaving chest, her fingers covering the almost invisible baby nipples, then slid her hand down so she could check the apparatus below. The child was wet and soiled, but felt made accordingly to standard design. The skin was the same miracle of fine smoothness that Melina had possessed as an infant. Come to Nanny, you horrid little thing, you. Nanny leaned to pick the baby up, mess and all. The baby swiveled to avoid the touch. Her head beat itself against the rush bottom of the basket. You've been dancing in the womb, I see, said Nanny. I wondered to whose music, such well-developed muscles. No, you're not getting away from me. Come here, you little demon. Nanny doesn't care. Nanny likes you. She was lying through her teeth, but unlike Rex, she believed some lies were sanctioned by heaven. And she got her hands on Alphaba and settled her on her lap. There, Nanny waited, groaning, and every now and then looking away out of the window to recover herself and keep from vomiting. She rubbed the baby's belly to calm the little girl down, but there was no calming her down, not yet anyway. Melina popped herself up on her elbows in the late afternoon when Nanny brought a tray of tea and bread. I have made myself at home, said Nanny, and I've made friends with your tiny darling. Now come to your senses, sweetheart, and let me give you a kiss. Oh, Nanny, Melina allowed herself to be coddled. Thank you for coming. Have you seen the little monster? She's adorable, said Nanny. Don't lie, and don't be soft, said Melina. If you're going to help, you must be honest. If I'm going to help, you must be honest, said Nanny. We need not go into it now, But I will have to know everything, my sweet, so we can decide what's to be done. They sipped their tea and because. Elphaba had fallen asleep at last. It seemed for a few moments like the old days at Golden Crowns, when Melina would come home for after-school noon walks with lightsome young gentry on the make and boast of their masculine beauty to a nanny who pretended she had not noticed. In fact, as the weeks went on, Nanny noticed quite a few disturbing things about the baby. For one thing, Nanny tried to remove the baby's bandages, but Elphaba seemed intent on biting her own hands off, and the teeth inside the pretty, thin-lipped mouth were indeed monstrous. She would bite a hole through the basket if they were left unfeathered. She went after her own shoulder and scraped it raw. She looked as if she were strangling. "Can't a barber be had to pull her teeth out?" Nanny asked. "At least until the baby learns some self-control." "You're out of your mind," Melina said. "It will be all over the valley that the little Maro is green. We'll keep the jaw strapped until we solve the problem. The skin problem." However in the world did her skin come green? Nanny wondered, stupidly, for Melina blanched and Frex reddened, and the baby held her breath as if trying to turn blue to please them all. Nanny had to slap her to make her breathe again. Nanny interviewed Frex out in the yard. After the double blow of the birth and his public embarrassment, he has not yet up to professional engagements, and sat whittling praying beads out of oak, scoring and inscribing them with emblems of the namelessness of God. Nanny sat Elphaba down inside. She had an unreasonable fear of being overheard by this infant, and worse, of being understood. And Nanny sat scooping out of a pumpkin for supper. "I don't suppose, Frex, that you have green in your family background?" she began, knowing full well that Melina's powerful grandfather would have confirmed such a predisposition before agreeing to let his granddaughter marry a unionist minister. Of all the chances she had. "Our family isn't about money or about earthly power," said Frex, taking no offense for once. "But I'm descended into a direct line from 6 ministers before me, father to son. We're as well regarded in spiritual circles as Melina's family is in parlors and at the court of Ozma. And no, there is no green anywhere. I never heard of such a thing before in my family." Nanny nodded and said, "Well, all right. I was only asking. I know you're gooder than goblin martyrs." "But," Frex said humbly, "Nanny, I think I caused this thing to happen. My tongue slipped on the day of the birthday. I announced that the devil was coming. I meant the clock of the time dragon, but suppose these words unlocked room for the devil." "The child is no devil," snapped Nanny. "She's no angel either," she thought, but kept it to herself. "On the one hand," Frex continued, sounding more secure, "she may have been cursed by Melina, accidentally, who took my remark the wrong way and wept about it. Maybe Melina opened up inside herself a window through which an unattached sprite entered and colored the child." "On the very day she used to be born?" said Nanny. "That's a capable sprite. Is your goodness so exalted that you attract the truly high-powered among the spirits of aberration?" Frex shrugged. A few weeks earlier he would have nodded, but his confidence was shattered with his abject failure in rush margins. He did not dare suggest what he feared. The child's abnormality was a punishment for his failure to protect his flock from the pressure of faith. "Well," Nanny asked practically, "if thought occurs the goods were damaged, then through what might the ill be overturned?" "An exorcism," said Frex. "Are you empowered?" "If I'm successful at changing her, we'll know that I'm empowered," said Frex. But now that he had a goal, his spirits brightened. He would spend some days in fasting, rehearsing prayers, and collecting supplies for the arcane ritual. When he was off in the woods and alfalfa napping, Nanny perched on the side of Melina's hard marriage mattress. Frex wonders if his prediction that the devil was coming caused a window in you to open, letting an imp pass through to spoil the baby, said Nanny. She was crocheting on edge of lace clumsily. She had never excelled at piecework, but she liked handling the polished ivory crochet hook. I wonder if you opened another window. Melina, groggy from Binlabo leaves as usual, arched an eyebrow in confusion. Did you sleep with someone other than Frex? Annie asked. Don't be mad, said Melina. I know you, honey, said Nanny. I'm not saying you're not a good wife, but when you had the boys buzzing around you in your parents' orchard, you changed your perfumed undergarments more than once a day. You were lusty and sneaky and good at it. I'm not looking down at you, but don't pretend to me that your appetites weren't healthy. Melina buried her face in the pillow. Oh, for those days, she wailed. It's not that I don't love Frex, but I hate being better than the local peasant idiots. Well, now this green child brings you down to their level. You ought to be pleased, said Nanny meanly. Nanny, I love Frex, but he leaves me alone so often. I would kill for some tinker to pass by and sell me more than a tin coffee pot. I would pay well for someone less godly and more imaginative. That's a question for the future, said Nanny sensibly. I'm asking you about the past. The recent past, since your marriage. But Melina's face was vague and blurry. She nodded and she shrugged. She rocked her head. The obvious theory is an elf, said Nanny. I wouldn't have sex with an elf, Melina shrieked. No more would I, said Nanny. But the green dust give one pause. Are there elves in the neighborhood? There's a gaggle of them, tree elves, up over the hill someplace. But if possible, they are more moronic than the fair citizens of Rush Margins. Really, Nanny, I've never even seen one, or only from a distance. The idea is repulsive. Elves giggle at everything. Do you know that? One of them falls out of an oak and smashes his skull like a rotten turnip, and they gather and giggle and then forget about him. It's insulting of you to even bring it up. Get used to it. If we don't find a way out of this quagmire, well, the answer is no. Then someone else, someone handsome enough on the outside, but carrying a germ that maybe you caught. Melina looked shocked. She hadn't thought of her own health since Alpha was born. Could she be at risk? The truth, said Nanny. We must know. The truth, said Melina distantly. Well, it is unknowable. What are you trying to say? I don't know the answer to your question, and Melina explained. The cottage was off the beaten track, and of course she never passed more than the courteous greetings with the local farmers and fishermen and pickets. But more travelers took to the hills and woods than you would credit. Often she had sat, listless and lonely, while Frex was off preaching, and she had found comfort in giving passersby a simple meal and a buoyant conversation, and more. But on those boring days, Melina muttered, she had taken to chew Binlabo leaves. When she would awake because the sun was setting, or Frex was there frowning or grinning at her, then she remembered a little. You mean you indulged in adultery and you don't even have the benefit of a good saucy memory about it? Nanny was scandalized. I don't know that I did, said Melina. I wouldn't choose to, I mean. Not if I was thinking clearly, but I remember once there was a tinker with a funny accent gave me a draught of some heady brew from a green glass bottle, and I had rare expansive dreams, Nanny, of the other world, cities of glass and smoke, noise and color. I tried to remember. So you could well have been raped by elves. Won't your grandfather be pleased to learn how Frex is taking care of you? Stop, cried Melina. Well, I don't know what's to be done. Nanny lost her temper. At last, everyone's been irresponsible. If you can't remember whether your marriage vows have been broken or not, there's not much good in acting like an offended saint. We can always drown the baby and start over. Just try drowning that thing, muttered Nanny. I pity the poor lake ass to take her in. Later, Nanny went through Melina's small collection of medicines. herbs, drops, roots, brandies, leaves. She was wondering, without much hope, if she could invent something that might cause the girl's skin to blanch. In the back of the chest, Nanny found the green glass bottles spoken of by Melina. The light was bad and her eyes weren't strong, but she could make out the words "Miracle Elixir" on a piece of paper posted to the front. Though she had a native skill in healing, Nanny was unable to come up with a skin-changing potion. Bathing the child in cow's milk didn't make the skin white either, but the child could not allow herself to be lowered into a pail of lake water. She twisted like a cat in panic. Nanny kept on with the cow's milk. It left a horrid sour stink if she did not rub it off thoroughly with a cloth. Rex organized an exorcism. It involved candles and hymns. Nanny watched from a distance. The man was beady-eyed, perspiring with effort, even though the mornings were colder and colder. Elphaba slept in her binding cloth and in the middle of the carpet, oblivious to the sacrament. Nothing happened. Rex fell, exhausted and spent, and cradled his green daughter within the grip of his arm, as if finally embracing the proof of some undisclosed sin. Melina's face hardened. There was only one thing left to try. Nanny gathered the courage to bring it up one day when she was to leave back for Cohen grounds. "We see that peasant treatments don't work," said Nanny, "and spiritual intersection has failed. Do you have the courage to think about sorcery? Is there someone local who could magic the green venom out of the child?" Rex was up and lashing out at Nanny. Swinging his fist, Nanny fell backwards off her stool, and Melina bobbed about her, shrieking, "How dare you!" cried Rex. "In this household, isn't this green girl insult enough? Sorcery is the refuge of the immoral. When it isn't out and out charlatanism, it is dangerously evil, contracts with the demons." Nanny said, "Who preserved me? You fine fanning man, don't you know enough to fight fire with fire?" "Nanny, enough," said Melina. "Hitting a feeble old woman?" said Nanny, hurt. "Who only tries to help." The next morning, Nanny packed her valise. There was nothing more than she could do, and she wasn't willing to live the rest of her life with a fanatical hermit and a ruined baby. Even for the sake of Melina, Rex drove Nanny back to the inn at Stone's Bar End for the coach and four to take her home. Nanny knew Melina might still think about killing the child, but somehow she doubted it. Nanny held her valise to her ample bosom, fearing bandits again. Inside the valise was hidden her golden garter. She could always claim it had been planted there without her knowledge, whereas it would have been hard to claim it had been planted on her leg in the same circumstances. She also had squirreled away the ivory crochet hook, 3 of Rex's prayer beads because she liked the carvings, and the pretty green glass bottle left behind by some itinerant salesman selling apparently dreams and passion and somnolence. She didn't know what she thought. Was Elphaba devil's spawn? Was she half-elf? Was she punishment for her father's failure as a preacher, or for her mother's sloppy morals and bad memory? Or was she merely a physical ailment, a bright-like misshapen apple, or a 5-legged cat? Nanny knew her worldview was foggy and chaotic, pestered by demons, faith, and folk science. It didn't escape her attention, however, that both Melina and Rex had believed uncompromisingly that they would have a boy. Rex was the 7th son of a 7th son, and to add to that a powerful equation, he was descendant from 6 ministers in a row. Whatever child, of either or any sex, could dare follow into an auspicious line. Perhaps, thought Nanny, little green Elphaba chose her own sex and her own color, and to hell with her parents.